Good evening. My name is Zishan Zaidi, and I'm an associate of the Student Advisory Committee here at the Institute of Politics. Now, over the course of this semester, our regular Thursday evening features at the ARCO Forum have focused on domestic political issues and their role in the presidential campaign. Now that Bill Clinton has been elected president and has been given a mandate for change, we want to address the question, will change occur in his administration? And to answer this question, we've assembled a panel of distinguished journalists and other experts.
My name is Lindsay Tomlinson, and I'm also an associate on the Projects Committee at the Institute of Politics. And I wanted to tell you about our Pizza and Politics dinner that we have every Thursday night, either before or after the forum. And it's a great chance. All students are welcome. Free pizza, and it's a great chance to eat pizza and talk with whatever distinguished panelist is there that night. Tonight, it's going to be right after the forum in the living room right over there with Mr. Wertheimer, Mr. Wertheimer, and it's going to be a lot of fun to eat pizza and talk with him and discuss further the issues that have been discussed here. So I hope to see you there. I'm going to turn over the panel now to Professor Richard Zuckhauser, who is a professor of political economy at the Kennedy School.
Thank you very much. I want to thank the Student Advisory Committee, and I want to thank all of you for coming. We're privileged today to have four of the most insightful participant observers on the American political scene today. I'll introduce them in a minute, but first I want to say a word about our topic. Probably no word except perhaps economy was spoken more frequently during this political campaign than change. And each of the three major candidates identified himself as a true agent of change. I should also mention that the proposal for this forum was made before the outcome of the election was known, though many people in this room knew the outcome of the election before the election was conducted. So we would have held this forum whatever had happened. There can be no doubt that the impetus for change came significantly from the poor performance of the economy. But when the candidates spoke about change and when Americans thought about change, it's clear they were worried about other issues as well, such as healthcare or education, and I think very significantly the way business is conducted in Washington. And when I speak of that, I think in particular of money in politics, and it's relevant given the book that one of our panelists is about to produce, Sex in Politics. The fact that Ross Perot wandered in and out of the campaign also was, first place, a change, at least in the way campaigns were conducted. But he, perhaps as much as Bill Clinton, was there saying things should be done differently in America. Given the mandate for change, given the fact that we have very substantial turnover in the Congress, we might expect to get dramatic and rapid reform. On the other hand, Washington has a way of working its wonders, and it's a shrewd and patient animal. Frequently, it will make efforts to co-opt and mandate any efforts to achieve change. So these efforts, added to the traditional inertia of government processes, may make it more difficult to achieve the types of changes that we would like to promote the long-run success of the nation. With that by way of introduction, I'll just tell you the first question I asked our panelists to focus upon, which is, what would you consider to be significant change, and how would you recognize it if we got it? I'm going to ask each of our four panelists to speak for 5 to 7 minutes, and then we'll have a conversation among the members of the panel, and finally, after we've done that for a while, we will open this up for discussion with the audience. I'm going to introduce the four panelists, and then they will speak in order from right to left. Jill Abramson, at my far right, is a crack investigative reporter for the Wall Street Journal. She has done as much as any journalist in recent years to identify the remarkable role of lobbyists and money on the national political scene. Jill is a graduate of Harvard, as is each of our panelists, though that's not why they were chosen. She's now working on a book about Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill, which will be available, which will be finished next June. And perhaps this book will suggest another area where our national political culture might change. E.J. Dionne, who's sitting directly to my right, now writes for the national news staff of the Washington Post. He had a distinguished career as a writer for the New York Times, but he's probably best known in this building for his recent book, Why Americans Hate Politics. It's received a great deal of attention, chronicling much of what needs to be changed in the American political arena if Americans are to rejoin the political process and to be enthusiastic about our political leaders and what they produce. EJ's greatest recent accomplishment is the production of his son 11 days ago. I should also mention that EJ is a summa cum laude graduate of Harvard College. Stanley Greenberg, sitting directly to my left, was the stealth member of the Clinton transition team, and we appreciate that he came. We only managed to get him because his secretary was willing to sky page him, even though he was circling in the immediate Boston area. Stanley has had an academic career as well as his current career as a survey and issue researcher, which I think most of us would think of as a pollster. He taught at Yale University, which is in New Haven, Connecticut, I think. And he's written extensively on a variety of topics such as poverty, the American identity, and democratic vision. His most recent accomplishment, this may not be his most recent accomplishment, but it's one he's the best known for recently, is that he played a major role in helping President-elect Clinton craft his strategy, which was basically for retrieving the traditional base of the Democratic Party, such as bringing home the Reagan Democrats. Mr. Greenberg, or Dr. Greenberg, received a PhD from Harvard University. Fred Wertheimer, who's sitting to my far left, is the president of Common Cause, the Citizens Lobby. Fred is a former fellow of the Institute of Politics. He's a graduate of the Harvard Law School. For 20 years, Fred has been speaking, wheedling, cajoling, politicking, and otherwise pushing to remove money from as a primary force in the American political scene. Today, it appears that Fred's ship may actually come in. Politics makes for strange bedfellows, and it may be that Ross Perot, a billionaire who's probably done better than just about any other man or woman in America, using money to manipulate the American political scene, was a major speaker against money in politics during the most recent campaign. President-elect Clinton is committed to significant campaign finance reform, and it will be interesting to hear what Fred has to say about the future of American politics in this area and many others. With that, by way of introduction, I'd like to turn to Jill Abramson. Yes. Oh, yes. Will the people in the back please be quiet? It's very hard to hear down in front. Thank you.
Hi. I do see Bill Clinton as a real agent of change and think that the potential for change, even in Washington, is enormous. But right now, as I talked to you, I thought this Newsweek cover, I don't know if all of you saw it on the newsstands or can see it now, but it shows Clinton in armor on a white horse being besieged by these mean, black, fire-eating Washingtonian dragons. And the question asked is, can Clinton tame Washington? And I really think that is the key question right now, that the culture of Washington is just so ossified at this point in time. It's hard to vividly describe it to you, but in brief, it's sort of a concentric circle of money, of different kinds of money, mutually aiding one another. There's lobbyists and their money, and they are, very, very, very aggressive, important beings in Washington. Just to throw out an astonishing figure to you, Bill Clinton is about to embark from Little Rock, Arkansas, population 158,000. He is coming to Washington, population of lobbyists 80,000. So, I mean, he has dealt with lobbyists as governor of Arkansas, but I'm sorry, he ain't seen nothing yet. And the lobbyists, of course, derive their clout in different ways. Most of them operate out of big law firms that have enormous lists of corporate clients whose interests have to be represented up on the Hill. Why is the lobbyist the person they need? Because the lobbyist, in turn, is the person who raises all the campaign funds for virtually all of the members of Congress. There are members of Congress, and Fred can tell you chapter and verse about this, who have been in for so long, have let their local fundraising networks atrophy to the point where they are raising all of their money in Washington at different dinner parties that lobbyists host. They usually don't even give you dinner. It's, you know, cocktails and hand over the dough. And, you know, how will I recognize change in Washington? There's a restaurant where just every night of the week a lobbyist is having one of these fundraisers called La Colline. It's fairly near the Capitol. You know, I recognize change when normal, wealthy people are eating dinner there instead of, you know, lobbyists and members of Congress and their staffs. I'll recognize it because presumably I'll have fewer great stories to write about, but there's always other topics to move on to. But right now in Washington, among those of us who have so carefully monitored the bad things that lobbyists and campaign fundraisers can do when they band together, is just this worry, seeing, you know, all the major lobbying firms had hired literally private planes, and the heads of their firms were, you know, en route to Little Rock to be on hand for the great victory. And some of them, you know, could justify being there. They had raised a lot of money for the campaign or provided other political advice. But, you know, it's still a little disconcerting to see that happening and to see them presumably welcomed in turn. And right now, a lot of those people are trying to get jobs in the cabinet or position themselves so that their influence will be even greater than it was during the Bush-Reagan years. And of course, what you have at some of the more famous Republican lobbying firms that had such a stranglehold on access during the Reagan and Bush years is you see them madly hiring up new hotshot Democrats so that their base will be covered. I guess my worry is just a sense in Washington that what we're seeing is people putting on different colored jerseys, like they're all putting on the Democratic jerseys, but that the game still is the same. And, you know, the game really has to change, and Bill Clinton is the only person who can really change it.
Thank you very much, E.J. Dion.
Yeah, I want to argue that Clinton actually has a great capacity for change, but first I want to give you my list of how you'll recognize change. You'll know it when applications to the Kennedy School and the Education School relative to the Business School go up. You'll recognize it when applications to the Harvard School of Public Health go up relative to the medical school. You'll know it when 60 Minutes or 2020 do long pieces about students rushing to a new domestic Peace Corps or about innovative new domestic programs that are reinventing government. You'll know it when Robert Reich or Rob Shapiro or Derek Shearer or Bruce Reed or one of these policy folks from Clinton gets on the cover of People magazine. In other words, when we're more interested in policy folks than Donald Trump. You'll know it when somebody can talk about at least the possibility of raising taxes without being lynched by his or her constituents. You'll know it if you see any kind of modest shift in the distribution of wealth and income away from the top 1 or 20%. And if it's truly Bolshevik-style change, you'll recognize it when Spike Lee praises Bill Clinton or when the Chamber of Commerce endorses a tax increase to pay for education, infrastructure, and job training. I'm not sure that's going to happen. But the issue of whether a newly elected president has a mandate for change, I think, depends on which side of the change you're on and which side of the new president you're on. Adlai Stevenson tells the story of the lawyer who goes to the jury and says, here are the conclusions on which I base my facts. And my conclusion up front is that, and it's my view of elections, is that to the victors belong the spoils, the bully pulpit, the mandate, and anything that's not nailed down. People rarely remember a victory margin as long as the victor acts like a winner. And no one understood this better than John F. Kennedy, who won by 100,000 votes. That was less than 2 votes per precinct, and probably just 1 vote per precinct if you threw out the Chicago returns. And he had an aide called Dick Donahue, who was the father of 8 kids and left him to go make money in the private sector. And Ben Bradley, who was later went on to Washington Post fame, was his friend and a reporter for Newsweek. And Bradley noted to Kennedy that Donahue had been described by Theodore White in the Making of the President book as coruscatingly brilliant. And Bradley asked Kennedy, how could you do without such a person? And Kennedy laughed and said, sometimes these guys forget that 50,000 votes the other way and they'd all be coruscatingly stupid. I really do think that once you win the election, you've got the power. In Clinton's case, 2.5 percentage points the other way, and it would have been coruscatingly impossible for him to make change. But I think he can do it. And I think that the numbers you need to look at, the number you need to look at is not the 43% that Clinton won, but 2 other numbers, which are 38 and 100. 38% is the percentage that George Bush got, and 100% is the amount of the White House that Bill Clinton controls. It seems to me clear that an incumbent president who sees his share of the vote drop from roughly 55% that Bush got in 1988 to 38%, when that happens, you're looking at a country that really wants change. The country itself is not entirely sure of what kind of change it wants now any more than it was in 1980 when it elected Ronald Reagan. It's worth remembering that although we talk about a Reagan landslide, Reagan only won 51% of the vote. He claimed an ideological mandate, and yet a New York Times CBS poll at the time showed that only 11% of his supporters said they voted for him because he was a conservative. Mostly people supported him because they were sick of Jimmy Carter, 21% interest rates, rising unemployment, the economy's stupid, in other words, as well as the hostages in Iran. Mostly they were interested in any kind of change that Ronald Reagan could bring about. And it's one of the things that always struck me about that election is roughly 40% of the people who said they were for Ted Kennedy in the primaries ended up voting for Ronald Reagan. So it's hard to describe that as a clear ideological mandate. So how did Reagan turn 51% into this mandate? Well, during the campaign, in fact, he left absolutely no doubt about who he was, what he stood for, or what he intended to do. The 1980 Republican platform was remarkably clear and specific. It was Reagan's platform, and he ran on it. Voters who supported him may not have agreed with him on everything, but they could not say that he tried to fool them. And once elected, Reagan did exactly what he said he would do. So what that 49% of the people voted against him? So what that the Democrats still control the House of Representatives? And so that what we got as a result of that is what Clinton liked to describe as 12 years of trickle-down economics. So what can we say about Clinton? It is true that he got 43%, which is not 51%. It's true that he is faced with a huge budget deficit, has a program that could involve spending a lot of money, and faces an electorate that still doesn't want taxes. Does he have to fall back on that wonderful David Ben-Gurion line? Ben-Gurion once said that in Israel, in order to be a realist, you must believe in miracles. I think the details I can leave to the poor economic folks who have to advise Clinton. But the truth is that for all the talk of Clinton being slick, he, like Reagan, was remarkably specific during this campaign. Like Reagan, his platform was very clear and included a whole list of specific programs, which parenthetically are very popular for the most part, and that's one of the reasons why I think he'll be able to get things done. And there were all kinds of specifics about what you should do about taxes and national service and job training and education and gay rights and welfare reform. And I think having run that kind of campaign, he is in a better position to get things done. And I think the other factor that gives Clinton room for maneuver is Ross Perot. I think that when you look at the results of this election and look at Perot, people have a tendency to say, well, these were votes cast against Clinton. That basically isn't true. The way I look at it is Perot is a kind of bookend, and the 1992 election is really a bookend to a period that started in 1968, and that Ross Perot is a figure much like George Wallace. The significance of the Wallace vote in 1968 was that he marked the end, the decay of the Democratic coalition in presidential elections that had so dominated our politics. Democrats who wanted to leave their party and independents who had voted Democratic, a lot of them went to Wallace, eventually went over to the other side. I think Perot could end up being very much that sort of figure. A lot of the people who voted for Ross Perot were either Reagan Democrats or Republicans or independents who leaned Republican, who were just tired of the Republicans in power. They were tired of Republican economic policies. They wanted change. Half the Perot voters who had a preference said that they were for Clinton over Bush. If Perot had not been on the ballot, according to the exit polls, Clinton would have won by 53 to 47 roughly, or 54 to 46. That's not a landslide, but it's solid enough. And that while Perot's constituency is not as coherent as Wallace's, and while his own views are not as pronounced as Wallace's were, Wallace was clearly running on a certain set of issues, I think you have the possibility that Perot could be the signal for an era of change. So what would the Clinton change look like? I'll just throw out a few quick things. One is I think the tax system would become more progressive and also more of an instrument of social policy. I think second, attitudes toward government would change. Government would no longer be seen as just the problem and could never be part of the solution. Related to that, and it goes back to what I said about People magazine, maybe we'll put Stan on the cover of People also, is that business would be seen as important but not heroic. And finally, I think liberalism itself would change. There'll be a lot more talk about reciprocal obligations, social responsibility linked to personal responsibility. And the last one is only my hope that the United States could take the lead with Japan and Europe in negotiating not just trade agreements, but also a coordinated effort to boost global growth rates. I'll conclude by saying that in some ways, to argue that Clinton could really achieve a lot of change on the basis of 43% of the vote goes against the view of one of his heroes, Thomas Jefferson, who said that you never achieve large changes on a slender majority. But I go back to the numbers where I started. 62% of the electorate voted for change. Clinton controls 100% of the White House, and even Theodore White might say that those are coruscatingly large numbers. Thank you.
Thanks, E.J. Stan?
Thank you for this opportunity. I used to do this almost every day for a living, but I've been held up in Little Rock in a war room and have spoken only in sound bites for the last 6 months, and I think this is the first time I will speak for 5 minutes at length. I will know change when Fred does not send me memos telling me what I'm now obligated to do. And I will know it when EJ, when I hear Bill Clinton no longer saying false choices as what we have to do as a nation, but clear choices, which he advances. I think that the question being posed by this panel is the right question, because I think this is a special political moment. It may be that I'm so close to this race that it looks bigger than life to me, but I think, in fact, that something historic has happened, which sets a context for considering the prospects for change. Clinton won in a national victory, which we have not seen, certainly on the Democratic side, and certainly not in an election absent a landslide. Bill Clinton swept New England. He won parts of the South. He swept the Pacific Coast. He won a fair part of the West, and he won the core of the industrial Midwest. This was a national victory, which reinforces, I think, the points that E.J. was making about the character of this win. It was also an election which I believe the Republican coalition collapsed. We may not yet, I think, fully understand it, but if one tries to think about what is now the identity of the Republican coalition once the Reagan Democrats have pulled off, once younger voters have pulled off, once independent suburban voters have begun to pull off, once the real tension between the evangelical right and the more libertarian younger independent voters is drawn sharply, as it was in this election, it becomes very hard to figure out what is the character of that coalition and how it again constitutes itself as a majority, and I'm not sure it'll be able to for some time. It's an election in which the incumbent president got 38% of the vote. It's an election in which there was I believe, an institutional and political crisis, perhaps I think overwhelmed by the attention to the presidential race. But there was an enormous upheaval in the House of Representatives and the Senate. The passage of term limits by large percentages in the in the various states, suggest a set of political institutions in crisis. And if you've spent any time talking to people who've run for office this year, which is a third of the Senate and the whole of the House of Representatives, I think they understand the degree to which they are challenged in this period. This isn't just Bill Clinton that has to face the question of change. We're also talking about a president who I think was specific in the terms that EJ has spoken of, but also a president-elect who has spoken about a scope of change, which we have not seen, I think, at least on the Democratic side for some time. This is not Jimmy Carter. The character of the change that Bill Clinton has been talking about is economic in character, a critique of trickle-down economics, a critique of the inequity in our tax system and the lack of income growth, but it was also a critique of the political system and demand for political reform. It was a critique of the healthcare system and demand for sweeping change and a larger governmental role. So that we're dealing with a president-elect who's not just been specific, he's talked about a scale of change across sectors, which requires, I think, if he is to succeed, instituting a program that has a parallel scope. Let me say something about just the areas where I think we will look for change. Some of it is obvious from the character of the campaign. And the economy is obviously the starting point. The public, I think, came to this election with a sense of the country in decline. It was also a sense that the leadership of the country was indifferent to that decline. But this was people's consciousness about the economy had gone well beyond the recession. Something I think that the economists, the press, have never quite understood, and certainly George Bush didn't understand when they hoped for good economic indicators in the last month, thinking that would reverse people's mood about the state of the country. This was a recession atop a couple decades of income stagnation, and people's critique of this economy goes way beyond the question of job generation in the short term and declining unemployment levels. This is a public that's very, very sensitive to the fact that they're working harder for less, that their living standards are declining, that their incomes can't keep up with critical costs, and their critique is of a fundamental sort. We're also talking about change in the whole area of leadership and action and capability. People's political imagination has been, I think, crushed through a combination of political cynicism at the top, but also the growth of the deficit and political leadership over the last 12 years, which basically said the country did not have the capacity to address its problems. When we did our research in this campaign, one of the most powerful critiques of George Bush was just the neglect of America. And it's not so much the question of foreign policy versus domestic. This is a country which people believe have large problems, and they believe they've had a leadership that denied them the capability to make change. And one of the critical areas of change, and it's going to be very hard to identify it in terms of what some specific action, is a growth in the sense of capacity, of political capacity of this country to address its problems and to move the country forward. The third area is the whole area of political trust, which I think is a central issue to this election, central to the evaluation of Bill Clinton. People have watched their leaders lie to them. From the Vietnam War through Watergate, through Read My Lips, and people believe without a touch of paranoia that their leaders lie to them. That's what they've come to expect of their political leaders, and they cannot trust that those who assume power will do what they say they will do, which leads them to believe, in fact, that they don't have choices and they don't have the capacity to effect change. I think a central part of the Clinton presidency will be on whether he can restore trust in the institutions and in the leaders. And the fourth area is the whole question of the people of this country versus special interests and the powerful. The people had, I believe, a critique that operated at two levels. One was a critique of the concentration of wealth and the notion that those at the top would get a variety of privilege for which they had an obligation to advance the public good, but which they believed was not advanced. And so the people came to this election wanting to see change in the power that wealth brought and also in the distribution of wealth. And people also wanted to bring ownership to the institutions of this country. People believe from the congressional level right up to the presidency that regular people have no real power. And when Bill Clinton jogs and goes to McDonald's and takes buses and campaigns with people, that there is a symbolic message there that he aspires to take the interests of people to him to Washington and challenge the special interests that have come to dominate. I don't know how to specify what will be major change. What I do know that it'll have a scope that we have not witnessed before, and it'll have to reverse in some kind of intangible way the sense of decline, the sense of incapacity, the sense that privilege governs, and bring in its place a feeling that the country is moving upward. I don't know how to specify that as a specific percentage increase in real income over a 4-year period, but I think we'll know it when we see it, when people have a sense that their lives can be better and that the country, in fact, is on an upward course, and a sense that people feel good about their country and their capacity to bring about change, and that they feel, in fact, that they own their own government.
Thank you, Stan. Fred Wertheimer.
Thanks, Richard. I'm very happy to be here. I'm particularly pleased that Stan is here because I've had on my list, one of the things I want to do is try to set up a meeting with him and lobby him, and I think this will work as a wonderful substitute. Richard talked about the race between the word economy and the word change as to which was the most frequently used word in this election. I counted during the election, and the answer is change. I'm quite convinced it was the most frequently heard word, if not just in the election, but throughout the year, almost everywhere you went. And certainly President-elect Clinton ran as an agent of change. We have 110 new House members who ran as agents of change. The most interesting thing is that a great many of the incumbents who were reelected ran as agents of change with a deep-seated desire to do something about those people in Washington. A core part of the change message had to do with changing the way business is done in Washington. Obviously, there were various aspects of it, and Stan has touched on them. But a core piece of this did relate to changing the way business is done in Washington, an issue which is a cross-cutting issue, which affects many of the other issues that have been talked about, that does affect the ability to deal with government problems, with the economy, with health care. It's also an issue that's at the heart of a disconnect that has built in this country in recent years between citizens and their government, their representatives. It's at the heart of a sense of alienation, cynicism, frustration. A very central part of, I believe, of what energized the public during this campaign, and it certainly was a central part of messages you heard from all over the place. President-elect Clinton made some very powerful commitments during the campaign on the issue of changing the system in Washington. I have developed a new hobby. I have saved every single word that President-elect Clinton has said about political reform and campaign finance reform. I'd like to read a few examples for you here. When President Bush vetoed the campaign finance bill earlier this year, Governor Clinton at the time said the following, "And I would urge Congress to go right back and give him a tougher bill. This is a very big issue with the American people, and it's a very big issue if we are ever going to get this government to work right. So I hope they will take his veto, write another bill, make it even tougher, and send it right back." In his book, Governor Clinton writes, "We cannot put people first and create jobs and economic growth without a revolution in government. We must take away power from entrenched bureaucracies and special interests that dominate Washington. American politics is being held hostage by big money interests. Members of Congress now collect more than $2.5 million in campaign funds every week, while political action committees, industry lobbies, and cliques of $100,000 donors buy access to Congress and the White House." And then Governor Clinton, in a video message to the 33 million members of AARP, said the following, There's a good reason public confidence in public officials is so low. It ought to be because of the dominance of special interests over the political process and especially over the campaign finance process. That's why I strongly support campaign finance reform. This is just a small part of the collection. If any of you are interested, there are lots of pages available. It does reflect something that dominated this campaign, and that was that change was a huge word on the campaign trail. But let me say to you that change is not a big word in the city where I live, Washington, D.C. The status quo, those are big words in Washington. Business as usual, very big words. Co-opting the change, bigger words. I kind of look at it as the notion of acclimatizing the new people to the way things are done. And you have in Washington today a city lying in wait, ready to acclimatize the Clinton administration, the new members of Congress, to why this is really the right way to do things. Just relax, calm down, you got here, you're in Washington now, disconnect, and let's go about our business. And business as usual in this system, and Jill captured it with the use of the word culture. It's a Washington lobbyist, special interest PAC, money culture. And it pervades the city. And continuing the flow of this money in various ways is at the heart of continuing the culture, continuing the status quo. And herein, I believe, lies a great battle that is going to take place in 1993. The mandate for change versus the Washington status quo. I also believe the outcome of this battle will go a long way towards defining the fate of the Clinton administration, President-elect Clinton's ability to govern, ability to solve this country's problems or lead us to solutions, and his own personal credibility. The money system works in very many ways. 1 minute left. I got a lot more than that. Let me give you my two favorite examples out of this election. In September, the lobbying firm headed by Charles Black, the senior campaign advisor to President Bush, made a $5,000 corporate soft money contribution to the Democratic National Committee's effort to elect Bill Clinton. The president's senior campaign advisor's lobbying firm gave $5,000 to the DNC soft money account to make sure President Clinton was elected. Why? We have this quaint custom in Washington in the lobbying world called inbreeding. As Jill was pointing out, doesn't matter, Democrats or Republicans, and want to make sure you're on the winning side. Second favorite example. In August of 1992, Edgar Bronfman gave $150,000 in soft money. That's money that's used to evade the system. As far as I'm concerned, it breaks the law, but the practitioners consider it a loophole. Mr. Bronfman gave $150,000 to the RNC for their effort to elect President Bush. That brought to $450,000 the amount of soft money he had gave to the RNC in a 16-month period. In September, Mr. Bronfman gave $100,000 to the DNC's soft money effort to elect Bill Clinton, and his son, Edgar Jr., also gave $100,000. This soft money switch hitting describes what the money culture is about. I will get later to what I believe are the tests of what is going to happen here, but let me close with this point. This system can be fundamentally changed, and it is singularly in Bill Clinton's hands as to whether that's going to occur or not.
Okay, I want to thank the four panelists for the first round here. I heard two criteria as to how we could tell whether things were changed. First was Jill's restaurant criteria, and the second was EJ's admissions office at the Kennedy School criterion. I like the second one a great deal more because that would be success for the people in this room. But if I had to crystallize the debate thus far, the people on the outside are sort of the cynics. They're the people who focus on the process. And they say, unless you change the process, Fred and Joe pointed out that we're not going to really accomplish very much. And there's a tremendous power of Washington to co-opt the process. In particular, I would just add that for those of you who are rosily optimistic, the presidents of Ron Brown and Mickey Cantor and Vernon Jordan, each a preeminent lobbyist in America, at the head of the Clinton campaign, is certainly, in some sense, business as usual there. On the other hand, if you listen to EJ and Stan, you get inspired. They talk about values, and they talk about issues, and they talk about restoring Americans' faith in the democratic process, and in particular, about getting young people, for example, the people in this room, to be involved in a domestic Peace Corps, to be working in education, to have a more redistributive tax system, etc. So I'd really like to ask the people on the outside to say, do they really think that a president who is so clear about articulating what he wants is likely to be trapped in this quagmire that's Washington? And I want to ask the people who are on the inside, can you be so naively optimistic, whether it's 43% or whether you in fact get the mandate that Ronald Reagan got? Ronald Reagan said what he was going to do. He got a mandate, but I think in Fred and Jill's terms, they would say, yeah, the tax system might have changed, but Washington operated just the way it had for the past 35 years. Basically, money talked. So we'll start with whomever wants to.
Well, I'd like to start by redefining your definition here. I am quite hopeful. I heard Jill say she was hopeful. And I certainly heard hopeful comments from Stan and EJ. My hope is based on a cautious sense of optimism that we are at a moment of fundamental change. And my comments about the process go directly to whether we're going to accomplish that change. I do believe that in order to accomplish substantive change, in order to allow people to be confident about their government, to feel good about what's going on, to have a sense that they're not being ripped off, that you do have to change the process. And I think the stage is set for doing it. However, it will require President-elect Clinton to be very tough-minded about this. There is no splitting the difference on this battle. You can't split the difference between Washington insiders and the people around the country on the question of whether or not the money influence that flows in Washington, D.C. is going to be fundamentally changed. You're going to have to fight that very hard.
I think the question is the right question, and I don't think we ought to be innocent about the process through which one has to make these changes. But it's important to, I think, understand that People First, which was an economic document, was meant to be a plan for changing the economy, that we consciously made one of our planks in our economic platform limiting the power of lobbyists and special interests on the belief that we could not bring the economic changes unless we simultaneously reduced the power of those interests that would oppose those changes. There cannot be the kind of change that we've talked about in the area of healthcare unless there is a change in this process. This is a very large part of the budget of the government of the United States, and there are very many Americans and many institutions whose fortunes are caught up with the healthcare system who have conflicting interests in this. This is not just a question of either ideology or policy preference. Bill Clinton's presidency requires reforming the healthcare system. You're dealing with a very constrained budget in which there are two areas in where there is any opportunity to provide the resources for change. One is in declining defense spending, and the other is in bringing healthcare costs under control. It is essential to his presidency to address the healthcare question. And I think we all understand that political reform either has to precede it or accompany it, because we can't get the change without opening up the process.
Okay.
I never argue with Fred Wertheimer about campaign money. If I remember Congress, I'd take him out to lunch and ask him how I should vote, and I'd vote for anything Fred Wertheimer told me to vote for on lobbying and PACs. But I think the issue really is, it's in a sense a chicken and egg question, which is how much pressure does an electoral campaign bring, and does a shift in the mood of the country bring on both people in Washington and the lobbying culture. There was a story in today's New York Times that was very interesting, lead of the paper, that the insurance industry has now come out and endorsed universal health care coverage. Now, from the point of view of people interested in various kinds of health reform, that's both good and bad news. I think what it does show is that everybody reads election returns, and that the insurance industry, for example, understands that some kind of health reform is going to come, and so they better not be only fighting it, they better do something. On the other hand, any kind of insurance reform, any kind of health insurance reform is probably going to have to be very tough on the insurers. I think it's interesting that in the Clinton campaign, one of the special interests that he consistently attacked when he talked about health care were the insurance companies. So that I guess I am perhaps in a foolish way, but nonetheless I am somewhat optimistic, because I really do believe that political pressure does get created by election results and the mood created by election results. The last thing is something that we haven't really talked about, and maybe we can get into, which is the whole issue of what other parts of the country are organized for change. I mean, my own view is that one of the reasons why you have had a decline in whatever you want to call it, liberal politics, progressive politics, left politics, is a sharp decline in the role of private sector labor unions. I think the decline of the labor movement really has had a lot of impact on the way politics is carried out. And unless certain kinds of organizing take place over the next 5 or 10 years, the pressure on Clinton himself to deliver on the promises he makes will not necessarily be there. I think that's the other piece of the campaign reform that Jill and Fred have talked about.
Jill?
Well, having been accused earlier of maybe being too unhopeful, I'd like to talk about a different, and I feel far more hopeful part of the change, and the change that I think President-elect Clinton is very much behind and part of, and that is the advent of all these new women elected officials. As we look around the transition team and some of these new clusters, some of them are headed by very, very respected, some of them quite young women, and that's just, in Reagan and Bush 12 years, that's something that's been missing. And I can remember vividly when I just knew that Bush was going to lose the election, and I was preparing to do a front page story in the Wall Street Journal 1 year after the Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill hearings, and the Wall Street Journal polls with NBC, and we had done a poll at the time of the hearings themselves, which, like other national polls at the time, showed that a majority of Americans believed Clarence Thomas, not Anita Hill. And it occurred to me that it would just be interesting a year later to ask the very same question we had asked. And indeed, we were stunned. I mean, the numbers had totally flipped. Our pollster, Peter Hart, had never seen anything quite like it. But in the crosstabs that I looked at to prepare to write the story, I looked at women under 40. And we also asked them their presidential choices within this poll. Among women under 40, the swing in who do you believe, Clarence or Anita, had been enormous. But in terms of presidential preference, women under 40, I think they account for at least 20%, if not more, of the electorate. It was a 62% Clinton, 31 Bush. And I said, if that's where Bush is with women under 40, forget it. They can hang it up. It's over. And, I think that it really is so hopeful to see women coming into the political system in the numbers, both as officials and as voters. And I was really moved at the Democratic Convention because, everyone wanted the Clintons to come to every event, and they were really laying pretty low. But he and Hillary both came to just this morning reception for all of the women Senate candidates, and just the tableau of, all these women standing up there was really an amazing sight, a real change. And now, the onus on especially the women who have been elected to the Senate to produce change and not also be co-opted by the culture is great. And the situation with Senator Packwood is going to be an early test of that.
Okay, I'd like to ask the panel one more question. I guess this is maybe principally addressed to Stan and EJ. But I'd like to advance the hypothesis that if we have a sort of underlying scale and everybody knows which way you want to go, it's easy to get change. So that Reagan, for example, wanted to cut taxes, particularly wanted to cut taxes at the top, and he was able to achieve that. And Clinton wanted to have a government which was more representative of America. So that's what he will be able to achieve. On the other hand, on some of the hard issues that are confronting America, and I would cite healthcare and education, it's not exactly clear how we should achieve or what we want to achieve. Let me mention two examples. This morning's New York Times came out in favor of managed competition in healthcare. I don't think that the New York Times would be identified as a publication that's hostile to Clinton, but there wasn't much enthusiasm for expenditure caps. And I would say among the people who supported and are legitimately interested in healthcare reform among the Democrats, there's very considerable disagreement over what should be done. When there is very considerable disagreement, it's much easier for the insurance companies, professional medicine, the hospitals, whomever else it might be, to subvert change to their own purposes. EJ mentioned that one of the reasons that we have had less force in progressive politics is because unions have had less impact. And probably one of the unions that had the greatest impact for the Clinton campaign was the NEA. And the NEA is opposed to domestic service, voluntary domestic service, which is another thing that EJ mentioned that he was in favor of. And probably that's one of the possible ways that we could get education reform, though I would assert even with education reform, it's a policy that everybody believes that we need, but there are very few people who know exactly what that should be. So I'm just wondering if you look at the issues where the people in this room might disagree as to what we should get, how will we be able to get beneficial change, or will we just have a squabble where the powerful long-term forces will ultimately win the day?
Well, I mean, there's a variety of areas where I don't think to say change is going to be easy, but change is, there are identifiable policies which I think the pressure of the moment will come to bear. I think there will be national service. I think we will see a Freedom of Choice Act. I think there'll be political reform. The three areas that, some of which you've talked about, the three areas I think that are, however, most important to whether Clinton succeeds as president are areas that are going to be very difficult to change. One is healthcare. Healthcare looks fine. I mean, I've pulled this. Healthcare is terrific as long as you're talking about how bad it is, but as soon as you begin to talk about the solutions, you begin to run into all kinds of difficulties, particularly amongst people who have reasonable coverage, so that ordinary folks who ought to be for a reformed healthcare system become people who have vested interest in an existing system on top of the institutions like the drug companies, insurance companies, and others, and the unions who have interest in maintaining their own control of plans. So actually changing the healthcare system in a fundamental way is an enormously difficult project. Education, I mean, we can talk about changes out of national service, which maybe put other people into the classroom, but fundamentally changing education in America is an enormous undertaking. And I think most difficult is the question of incomes. I mean, I believe that the malaise in the country is rooted in a sense of stagnation and a sense that one's children aren't going to have a rising living standard. Republicans have been content with growth in GNP. Bill Clinton, Democrats, in my view, given the critique that they have aired, can only be satisfied with real income growth. This is not just an American problem. This is an international problem. It has to do with the stage of industrial development, and it is not something that's wholly in the hands of a Clinton presidency to fashion. But income growth and people again believing that there can be rising incomes is a fundamental change important to his presidency, difficult to fashion. So that we ought to focus on the specific things that he can do in the short term. We also need to keep in mind the scale of what he has to take on during the course of a 4-year or 8-year presidency, and those are difficult tasks.
I just want to underline something Fred had said earlier. Came to mind when he talked about incumbents running as candidates of change. My favorite slogan of the year was an incumbent congressman in Pittsburgh. I can't remember who it was, who won, by the way. And he ran a campaign where he talked constantly about how much he'd been in Washington for 12 years fighting for change, and his slogan was, "Keep the change." That does tell you something about the year. When I had mentioned the decline of unions, I specifically said the decline of private sector unions, and I think that this is probably beyond the scope of this discussion today, but I think that one of the things that is sort of roiling our politics is a shift in the balance within the trade union movement between public sector and private sector, where unionism has almost come to seem to a lot of people as representing essentially tax consumers against other kinds of folks, but that's a wholly different discussion. I think that I would just make 2 points in terms of how the climate of the country can affect even interest groups. One is on the issue of national service, where in fact you've seen a shift on the part of public sector unions who have become more sympathetic. In this exchange between Clinton and the public employee unions, it wasn't simply a one-way street, and I think you've seen some embracing of this concept. I think there'll be a lot of fights, there'll be a lot of problems in doing it, but I think they are more open than they would have been 5 or 10 years ago, partly because public sector unions right now are very worried simply about keeping the public sector alive, and I think would be quite happy to do some of these things. And on school choice is another area where the AFT, although I think not the NEA, are now sympathetic at least to public school choice programs in a way they weren't 5 or 10 years ago. So even they are feeling the winds of change. On health care, I agree with his broad point that health care is such a minefield that because there are so many difficult issues to be resolved, the special interests, who include all kinds of people, will have more than their say in how this is done. To some degree, I think that's inevitable. I think what any kind of healthcare reformer has going for him or her right now is fear. Fear on the part of everybody involved in this discussion. Even people who have very good private health insurance plans are worried about losing them. And I think it was Stan who once told me that the power of that issue comes not from the uninsured, but from people worried about losing coverage or having their coverage go down. Insurance companies are very worried about a national health system. One of the reasons I think they're moving toward participation in this debate is because they don't want their share completely wiped out. So they're going to be at the table already prepared to move some. I don't think this means that this will be easy. I think healthcare is a nightmarish issue to resolve. But I do think that the political pressures that have been felt in the country in the last couple of years are even being felt among the special interest groups.
Thank you,
So-called.
Fred?
I share EJ's thoughts about larger forces that can be brought to bear in terms of the power of interest groups. I also, though, would point out that we're in day one of the Clinton administration, and the ability to function and deal with the power of interest groups in the system in a honeymoon year, in the first 6 months, in the first year, versus being able to deal with it over a longer term are very different questions. I focus my comments on something that some people would consider very narrow, but I do believe it's across the whole sense of what we're about as a people and how we govern ourselves. But I also, just on a personal comment, believe that we're at a moment of some larger change taking place, or opportunity for change. And I do mean that from a personal standpoint. I came to Washington, D.C. in December of 1963, which was a month after President Kennedy was assassinated. And I wound up in the business I'm in because of the messages and words that President Kennedy used during his presidency. They led me to do what I've done for most of my life. I have been in Washington for approximately 30 years, through a period of first Vietnam, then Watergate, then a very difficult economic period for President Carter, and then a 12-year period of very strong anti-government philosophy. And I just have this sense because I'm getting old, that we're coming to the end of what I see as a 30-year cycle, and opening up the opportunities for something very new and potentially very exciting. Part of President Clinton's message that I find very appealing is the notion of proactive government. Now, not in the classical sense that it has been used in the past, but under different circumstances and different context, kind of a sense, again, of problem solving, a shared approach to problem solving at a time when the country does want change and does feel the need for problems to be solved. And that is a very exciting opportunity, and that's where the very hopeful side of me stands. I am a genetic optimist. That's the only way you could do what I do. But I have to repeat that potentially standing in the way of long-term progress in healing ourselves as a society is a system in Washington that is of itself, for itself, by itself, and that is rooted in money as the medium of exchange of power in our society. That system has to be shaken up for the hope to be turned into progress. I think we got a real chance of it happening, but I assure you it will be a brutal battle next year, and a very sophisticated battle where the effort to stop this will be done through the notion of creating change without changing things. That will be the goal, and that's what to watch for, cosmetic versus real change.
Good. Well, I think that's a fitting note in which we'll open up the questions to the audience. If you have a question, please go to one of these two microphones. We're looking for questions. Speak for no more than 45 seconds and ask a question rather than make a statement. So why don't we start over here? And you can address it to the panel or to any individual.
I sort of make a statement, I guess. My name is John Cullinane, and a few years ago I made some money via a high-tech company, and since that time I've been besieged by politicians wanting money, and I have contributed many times. And I even headed up a New England Business Executives for Clinton Gore and raised close to $1 million. All right? And so far I haven't been to Little Rock, and I haven't asked for anything in return, and haven't asked any politician for anything. But I would like to ask the Clinton Gore team, and I think they're going to do it, is to change these finance laws. This business of soft dollars, the whole thing is an absolutely terrible system. And I just feel that maybe this is the time that it will come to pass, and I certainly believe Clinton is going to make some effort in this direction. This country, when you go to some of these fundraising efforts and all the rest of it, the people you see and meet, it's a very bad scene. Okay?
I would ask Fred whether he agrees, but I think we know the answer to that question. Yes, sir?
Well, I want to just briefly say that when you mentioned that Clinton swept New England, let's not forget that he didn't win a single Democratic primary in New England. Zongas won in New Hampshire, and Jerry Brown won in Connecticut, Vermont, and Maine. And I think it's important to remember some of that history, and maybe what I would argue is the meaning of it. I want to get into this question about change, because I think, at least for me, that's what the question is about. I mean, is it going to be cosmetic? Is it going to be public relations? Is it going to be how perceptions and what people believe, or is it going to be how real is it really going to be? You can get things done, but what is it that you're going to get done? Specifically, yesterday's New York Times has an article about the executives of Disney exercising their stock options and then selling them, and to the tune of $220 million a piece, or I don't know, I mean, the figures are there in yesterday's article. That's how they're getting around this big tax redistribution thing that was mentioned. How real is tax redistribution when things like that are going to be happening and people putting their money in mutual funds? Secondly, what about this Vernon Jordan thing and people like him when they're already playing around with the definition of what is and what isn't a conflict of interest, when he's going to be able to be involved in, they're saying, well, he can be involved in decisions about having to do with health policy. And finally, on the health care, there is evidence, I think, that single payer is strongly supported by large numbers of Americans, but there seems to be, today's New York Times, various other bits of information, managed competition seems to be the buzzword and what people think is going to end up being the so-called reform. Are single-payer people going to be involved in this? Are they going to be at the table? Because there's a lot of strong support for it and a lot of good arguments for it.
Thank you. I guess that question's for you, Steve.
Well, I mean, I just don't know how to answer the question of what's real and what's not real. That some people have exercised options to avoid change that's coming, to my mind. I watched that and said, you drew the conclusion that, that people will find their way around these changes and minimize the impact on them. I'm watching the insurance companies, and I know one can say that they're on the verge of co-opting the change. Clearly, that's you can imagine that that's their strategy, but that the insurance companies have announced for universal care that, and I saw an ad in the New York Times where the federal public sector unions did a piece on the need to reinvent government. And then I see individuals selling off stocks to avoid what is going to be an increase in taxes for those earning over $200,000. I look at that same set of evidence and say that they must be seeing significant change coming. There's certainly a battle on whether they're going to succeed in co-opting the change or whether change is going to be real, but there's certainly going to be a battle about real change. I don't know what to say about the outcome. On the question of single payer, I've spent a lot of time on this question, mainly for people who would like to see single payer systems, and we should not delude ourselves to the degree to which the public is anxious to substitute a single payer system for a mixed system. I'd like to see them go to a single payer system, but the public is of many minds on this and ambivalent and confused. I think there's a lot of room for presidential leadership in shaping where we go, but you should not assume that the people are with you. The moment you take health care reform and universal health care from the rhetoric to the specific, you get down to about a 51-52% margin. There is not a large majority for any specific overhaul of the health care system.
But strong support is the word that I use.
Thank you. Yes, sir?
I'm Wayne Cox. I'm a Bush Leadership Fellow from Minnesota, and I'd like to direct a question to Stanley Greenberg. Stanley, about 3 years ago, you and I were on a panel together in Minnesota, and I'd like to say that the vision you had then, in terms of the kinds of issues that traditional Democrats would respond to, was a virtual blueprint from the Clinton campaign, and I think you have a lot to do with that success, and I want to recognize it today. But the question I have has to do with the concerns of Fred Wertheimer. I very much agree with the type of concern he has that the influence and money is going to swallow up the agenda down the road, and wonder specifically what is being done now in the transition stage with the Clinton campaign to put that issue on front burner. Is there a designated transition team member in charge with developing a plan that can move out in the first 100 days so that you can have political reform and campaign finance reform at the very high on the agenda and come out running when the presidency it falls in Bill's hands?
Do you want to address it or I'll? Well, you're talking to them. I can't answer the question. I mean, the question of what will be in the first phase, what will be addressed in the first phase of the Clinton program is not resolved. I mean, the players aren't in place, and the discussion has begun. But I think it's premature at this point to say what will be part of that. What will be part of that first phase. I don't know whether it's 100 days, but this will be a focused initial period. I mean, I think one thing we all agree is that we will not come forward at the outset with the entire Clinton program. That we will begin in a very focused way. Surely the economy is part of that, but I'm not sure what is specifically in the first phase. However, there are people now addressing the question of political reform and campaign finance reform and ethics reform and lobby reform, and it's a very active part of the transition now. Now, you may want to talk about your...
Well, let me just comment. In 1977, we had a remarkably similar circumstance to now. We had a new president in favor of very comprehensive reform, had majorities in the House and Senate, as we do today, on record for reform. President Carter allowed that proposal to be delayed for 6 months. In the summer of 1977, Republicans were able to put together a filibuster that killed campaign finance reform for the next 15 years. Senate Republicans have killed campaign finance reform in 1977, 87, 88 by filibusters. In 90 and 92, the legislation passed because President Bush was there to veto it. So the first test here is speed. If this issue is not in the first 100 days, that is a signal that it's in danger. That's just my flat-out political view. Senate Majority Leader Mitchell has stressed that he wants it moved early. There are very disturbing signs on the House side out of the leadership that they are arguing that this should be delayed and pushed back. Delay does two things. It allows opponents to put together a campaign to either kill or gut, and it takes you away from the election and the mandate and to the next election and the fundraising. So you watch. If this is not in the first 3 months' agenda, if there is not a tough package out of President-elect Clinton, or if he is not a public voice on this and actively engaged, this issue is jeopardized. Now, I know everyone in America with an issue is making the same argument. I can just tell you that on this issue, it is not a question of priorities and timing and process. It is a question of whether it's going to happen or not, whether it is going to pass as strong legislation, or whether it's going to be gutted either by a Senate filibuster or by Democrats and Republicans figuring out how to dilute it. That's at stake in the decision Stanley's talking about.
Let me make a quick point that I think that whatever the Senate does with it, it is clearly in Clinton's interest to do something on this fast for a simple reason, and it's called the Perot vote. If you look at the Perot supporters, they're not united by anything, really. They are all over the lot ideologically, except for three things. They care about the deficit, they care about the economy, and they think the political system is corrupt. Clinton probably will not give some of the Perot people what they are looking for in terms of rapid deficit reduction, if that is indeed what they would want once they saw what it looked like, but he can give them political reform. And so at least my guess, and the president's pollster would be able to do a better job of telling him about this, is that one of the easiest things he can do to send a signal to the Perot constituency is on process reform.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi, my name is Teresa Bourgeois, and as an aside, I'd like to add to E.J. Dionne's list. And with all due respect, sincere respect to the panel, I'll also know there's change when panels like this, when the media, when political pundits, as well as political operatives, more accurately reflect the diversity of our country, really with all due respect to you folks. But on the question of fundraising, you talk about the problem with the money coming in, but there was no discussion about how it's spent, and no discussion about the elected officials feeling as distasteful as Fred Wertheimer does about the money. And it occurs to me that a significant portion of that money goes to media outlets in the form of media buys. So can we have this discussion? Is there hypocrisy in the media criticizing without doing something about this issue of the media buys? Maybe Mr. Wertheimer knows the percentage of the money, I don't know, but I know it's pretty high, and you have to get on TV. So what about the dynamic here with the money being raised and how it's spent?
Well, the legislation passed by the Congress this year would have begun the process of creating very cheap TV for candidates who agree to spending limits, would have in effect set up a system of free TV to reduce the cost in that area. And that's a recommendation and proposal that President-elect Clinton has made as well, to open up the airways and to greatly reduce the cost. TV is a very substantial part of the expense of all campaigns, and it is part of what drives the need for money and therefore drives the private fundraising side in congressional races. So it's an important area. It's an area that Congress has really started addressing, and that has been a key part of what the Clinton proposal has been.
And part of the timidity of Congress in going after just the broadcasting costs is the National Association of Broadcasters is one of the most powerful lobbies in Washington. It really requires, in essence, bullying them into submission to agree to provide free or dirt cheap time. But while TV is definitely the numero uno expensive thing that these guys spend their campaign money on, I mean, Sarah Fritz and Dwight Morris of the LA Times just published a fantastic book which is about what they do with all this money, and you'd be amazed what they do with it. It goes, from everything to literally, tens of thousands of dollars spent on flowers sent to constituents for either happy or sad events, to, but the numbers are just astronomical, to, all of the, or most of the senators who have found themselves in hot water at the ethics committee, like the Keating Five. Two of those senators set up legal defense committees, senators who, congressmen who are on trial, like Ford in Tennessee. He pays for his legal fees, and that case is going on, I think, nearly 7 years now. Just campaign money pays for all of that. So it's not just the TV.
One representative spent $247,000 in a 2-year period on food, an average of $147 per day in campaign money.
My name is Ross Guerin. I'm the chair of the Student Advisory Committee here at the Institute. I'm very glad to see you all here. It seems to me that the promise of change is in many ways tied up with the promise of the Democratic leadership on the Hill to deliver the Congress up to the Clinton plan. To what extent do you think that the 100 new members of Congress are going to undermine that promise and kind of threaten to thwart the Clinton plan?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question. We conducted, at least in the area we're talking about here, it's just the opposite. We conducted a campaign during the election to get candidates on record, a public commitment to change the system in Washington. On the Democratic side, 51 of the 63 new members have signed on to a statement, I want to change the system in Washington. I publicly commit to support and vote for anti-corruption legislation with all the essential elements of reform. It is at the top that we're worried about, because that's where the pressure of the more senior members are, who are queasy about moving along. So if it's up to the freshmen, I think they have their necks on the line. They really did come here with a message on change, and I don't think they'll be the problem. I think the tension will come with more senior Democrats, and particularly on this timing question.
What about with other Clinton programs? I think Mr. Green.
Well, it's actually one of the concerns I have. I mean, certainly if you look at the Republican new members, if the previous Republican class, as an example, tearing down the institution was a primary agenda, but they didn't have a great interest in campaign finance reform. I worry that while I take the political reform agenda and I think it has to go hand in hand with a larger change agenda, I worry that political reform becomes a substitute for real change. From my view, political reform is a way of being able to change health care and change the economy. And I'm not sure that the new member, that the mood of this particular election at the congressional level was sending a message about health care and about the economy. And I'd like to know more about what these new members are thinking on those questions.
I think also if you look back to the Reagan experience, one of the reasons he pulled off what he did is because there was a group of conservative Democrats who agreed with him on principle and worried Democrats who voted with him because they were scared for their lives. And I think one of the interesting things about Clinton's program is that there are a lot of moderate and liberal Republicans. There are more of them in the Congress than there are usually at Republican conventions. And that there are a number of those who could be part of a congressional coalition on behalf of a lot of the Clinton programs. And I think that this notion of momentum that President Bush liked to talk about, I think has some effect on Congress, and that there is the possibility that Clinton could use sentiments among these Republicans to add to his congressional base and also to make up for defections. The problem is in the Senate, where you do have a filibuster capacity and where the Democrats don't have the votes to break the filibuster and where people tend to vote with their parties on those questions. And I think that's where he could run into trouble.
Just one point on Stan's point, on the Republican question. That has been true in the past, but 40% of the House Republican candidates running this time on this issue signed on to this.
I apologize, this is going to have to be our last question. This gentleman over here.
Yeah, my question is really to Dr. Greenberg. My name is Bob Buckler. I had the good fortune to run for school committee here in Cambridge and also to direct the independent campaign, the 2nd Suffolk senatorial seat. What I'm really interested in hearing from you is really, what was the strategy to get back the white ethnic vote to the Democratic Party? Truly, what is the strategy? And I say that in preference of the American history. I know that at the end of the century, the decision was to appeasement of the Dixiecrat, which means that a lot of black Americans and other people of color lost their homes and their businesses, and terrorism rose in this country like no level before, even during slavery. I know that during Richard Nixon and Pat Moynihan, the architect of a strategy was really to deal with a large black migration who was not prepared to live in an industrialized area, who had come from a place where they did their own farming, on their own land. So that architect put them on social welfare programs, including the professionals. I mean, where you had 70% of college graduates, blacks, who were running social welfare programs. We know that Reagan program was one of appeasement. We know that Lyndon B. Johnson said, "The hell with that. I'm going to lose this election, but I'm going to show those Eastern elite liberals that I am no softy. I will put through a civil rights bill." So I want to know, in very clear terms and plain terms, what was the Clinton strategy to get back the white ethnic vote? Thank you.
Well, I'm not sure what the Clinton strategy is. There's a piece I wrote in American Prospect.
You're the architect.
I know. Well, I'll talk about at least I'll talk about my contribution to it. In the American Prospect in, I believe, September of 91, where I talk about this question, where I argue that what the Democratic Party needed to do was to constitute itself as a middle-class centered bottom-up coalition, and that the Democratic Party, which governed by an elitist liberalism, offered a lot of symbolism to minority members of that coalition, but unable to govern, actually offered very little that was tangible, and that was in fact patronizing. Under that strategy, we watched a minimum wage that was unchanged for some 2 decades. We watched poverty rates grow. And to say that to try to refashion or reproduce that same coalition and the same result and view that as more principled and more true to the base of the coalition, I think was both patronizing and I think deceptive. What I argued is that a majority coalition which was broad-based and which respected the values of the majority of Americans could govern. And that the best poverty program in this country was the Social Security system. And the reason why the Social Security system enjoyed such strong support was because of its broad-based character, and that we ought to build a coalition that had universal programs, and on that basis brought everybody in. It was very important, and someone mentioned what happened in New England in the primaries. I think very important to understanding what happened in the general election is to understand what happened with Bill Clinton throughout the primary process, in which he won between 60 and 75% of the black vote. He put together a black-white coalition centered on middle-class values, work values, and because he won the primaries with black support, was able to take his message to the American people in the general election and argue for universality while having the credibility of understanding that he did not run against black voters in the primaries. He first ran in 1992 to win black voters with his message, unchanged. And that's what made it possible to have a broad-based message which brought black and white together in the coalition that won in November.
I'd like to thank all of you. We will reconvene this panel in 3.5 years, or perhaps in 1 year, to see what has been accomplished. And I want to thank the panelists very much for participating today. It is very enjoyable. Thank you very much. Good luck with your book. Hope you guys